October 25, 1861, in Van Buren, Arkansas, James Brown Miller was born into a country already split by war, and the split taught children fast lessons. Trust was scarce, tempers were quick, and a man who could hurt others often walked with more freedom than a man who could not. Van Buren sat on the Arkansas River, a working town where freight, timber, and farm goods moved through in mud season and dust season, and where violence was never far from the places people gathered. The courthouse square, the river landings, the rough edges of saloons, and the back rooms where debts were demanded. The early records do not preserve a neat, comfortable story of his childhood. What can be stated with certainty is that he grew up in the years when families rebuilt after the Civil War, when law could be present in name and absent in reach, and when discipline inside a house could be harsh because food and security were fragile. In that environment, a child learned what fear could accomplish. Fear shut mouths. Fear prevented witnesses. Fear made neighbors take the long road instead of passing a certain gate. As he moved from boyhood into youth, the Miller family left Arkansas and relocated to Texas, eventually settling in Coryell County. The precise year of the move is not recorded in surviving summaries, but by the time the 1880 federal census was taken, Jim Miller was listed in Coryell County with his widowed mother and his siblings. The household was a working household. Coryell County lay in central Texas ranch and farm country, and Gatesville was the county seat. A courthouse town where cattle, cotton, and local politics mixed with personal grudges that could last longer than a drought. Life there demanded endurance more than elegance. Water came from wells, springs, and creek beds that could shrink or fail. Roads were rutted tracks that could swallow wagon wheels after rain. Fences mattered because loose stock meant ruined crops and fresh arguments. A young man who wanted a place in that world had to work, and he also had to manage his standing with other men. Reputation traveled faster than a horse. A rumor could close doors to employment. A violent incident could cut a family in two and turn neighbors into enemies who looked for excuses to draw steel. Jim Miller learned early how to look steady under scrutiny. Neighbors and relatives could see who was quick to anger and who stayed quiet until it was time to act. Some men fought with fists in public, announcing their temper to everyone. Other men stored their anger and used it in private, choosing surprise rather than spectacle. Miller came to prefer the second style. It did not require an audience, and it did not invite the kind of immediate retaliation that followed a fair face-to-face fight. Family ties sharpened the danger. His sister Georgia married a man named John Coop. That marriage bound Coop to the Miller household by law and by daily proximity. It also created a point of friction that did not burn out. In rural Texas, a quarrel inside a family did not stay inside the family. It spilled into churches, into fence-line conversations, into the small courthouse corridors where people waited for their turn with a clerk. A man who carried a grudge could not hide it for long, because everybody saw who refused a handshake, who refused a meal, who watched a doorway too closely when a certain name was mentioned. By the early 1880s, Jim Miller and John Coop had a relationship that the community understood as hostile. The details of each argument are not preserved in one clean record that settles every moment, but the outcome is preserved, and it is the outcome that shaped everything that followed. The conflict did not end with a separation or a truce. It ended with a shotgun. July 30th, 1884 arrived in Coryell County with the dry weight of a central Texas summer. Heat pressed down on yards and porches. Night offered only partial relief, and sleep came in fragments when flies, sweat, and lingering anger kept a mind working. On that Wednesday, John Coop was at his home near Gatesville when he was killed by a shotgun blast while he slept. He did not meet his killer in the open. He did not have time to reach for a weapon. The death was sudden, brutal, and final, and it landed inside a family circle where every person would remember it for the rest of their life. A shotgun was a farm and ranch tool as common as an axe, and it carried a different kind of authority than a pistol. At close range, buckshot struck in a cluster, shredding tissue and breaking bone in multiple places at once. There was no neat wound to bandage. There was no clean path of a single bullet that a doctor could probe and remove. The damage could be overwhelming in a single second. In a sleeping killing, the victim also faced the shock of waking into pain with no chance to bargain, plead, or defend. The blast woke the house and the surrounding yard. In isolated places, a gunshot in the dark meant immediate action. People grabbed lamps. Someone called a name. Footsteps ran across boards and packed dirt. Then the scene came into view under lantern light. A man struck down, the heavy smell of burned powder hanging in the air and blood spreading where it had no business spreading. Grief in those moments did not begin as tears. It began as a frantic search for help that everyone knew would arrive late. It began as hands pressing down, voices trying to keep someone alive who could not be kept alive, and the sick realization that a single decision had turned a home into a crime scene. Suspicion settled fast. The victim was John Coop, and the person with the most visible hostility toward him was Jim Miller. The killing did not occur in a vacuum. It came at the end of a known dispute, and the dispute turned into motive in the minds of neighbors and lawmen. Miller was arrested and charged with murder. That step mattered because it meant the county was willing to put the accusation in writing, to bring the case before a court, and to attempt to impose a punishment that would outlast family threats. The legal process in a Texas county at that time was both formal and personal. A courthouse could hold a trial with a judge, lawyers, and a jury, but the people inside the room often knew each other outside the room. Witnesses lived among the families involved. Jurors did business with the accused or his relatives. A sheriff or deputy might have grown up beside the men he arrested. That closeness could cut two ways. It could produce truth because lies were easier to detect when everyone knew the history. It could also produce silence because a witness who testified against the wrong person might find a fence cut, a barn burned, a horse stolen, or a dark figure waiting at the edge of a yard. Miller's case moved through that system and a jury found him guilty. The sentence was life in prison. For the community, the verdict promised an end to one threat. A life sentence implied that John Coop's death would not be answered by more deaths, because the man blamed for it would be removed from the county and locked away. It also suggested that the courthouse still had power in a place where people often doubted it. Then the verdict did not hold. Miller appealed, and the conviction was reversed on a technical point. The record in later summaries describes the reversal as a procedural matter, not a declaration that the killing never happened. The reversal opened the door to a second trial, but a second trial did not occur. The result was that Miller did not serve the life sentence the jury imposed. He escaped the punishment that many in Coryell County expected, and that escape taught him a dangerous lesson. The law could be fought with lawyers and patience, and a killing could be survived if the right cracks appeared in the process. The reversal also taught the community something bleak. A murder conviction could be broken after the fact, and the family of the dead could watch the accused walk free. That knowledge did not heal anything. It sharpened anger. It deepened the sense that formal justice was fragile. Some people accepted the court's outcome because resisting it meant resisting the structure that held communities together. Others carried the bitterness as a personal duty, the duty to remember, to watch, and to settle accounts when the law failed to settle them. Miller returned to ordinary movement with extraordinary consequences hanging on his name. A man could still find work after a killing if he had the right connections and the right silence, but he could not live as if nothing had changed. Faces turned away in town. Conversations stopped when he stepped onto a porch. A simple trip to a store became a measure of nerves because an angry relative could be waiting behind a door. In rural communities, men did not need to announce a plan to hurt someone. They rode up, they stepped down, and they acted. Miller did not become famous in Coryell County for flashy gunfights. His notoriety began with an ambush-style killing that removed a sleeping man from the world. That detail mattered because it showed what kind of violence he was willing to use. It also showed a willingness to treat murder as a solution rather than a last resort. In the years to come, writers would attach grand nicknames to him, including nicknames that suggested religious devotion. But those later labels did not change the truth of how his public story began. A family dispute ended by buckshot, followed by a conviction that failed to hold. The escape from a life sentence did not end the pressure around him. It shifted it. Remaining in Coryell County meant living under a cloud of suspicion and threat. It meant risking a revenge killing from Coop's people. It meant watching every open space, every window, every figure on the road. It also meant staying within reach of lawmen who might find another charge to stick if he gave them a new reason. For a man who had learned that surprise worked and that legal cracks could be used to slip through, leaving was not cowardice. Leaving was strategy. So he headed west, away from Gatesville, away from the porches and fences where the Coop killing remained the central fact people remembered. West Texas and the border regions offered distance and fresh anonymity. They also offered new forms of conflict, cattle disputes, political feuds, and policing that depended on individual will more than consistent institutions. A man could build a second identity there, one that mixed respectable appearances with private violence, and a man who had already proven he could walk free after a documented murder could carry himself with a colder confidence than he had carried before. When Jim Miller rode out of Coryell County after the Coop case unraveled, he carried more than a shotgun skill and a grudge history. He carried proof that he could take a life inside a family dispute and still return to the road a free man. That proof would shape his choices, the company he kept, the jobs he accepted, and the methods he relied on when he wanted someone gone. The first documented killing did not close a chapter for him. It established a pattern that the rest of the frontier would eventually pay for. Freedom after a murder verdict creates its own danger. Some men leave because every face around them has turned into a threat, and some leave because they know their own temper will drag them into more trouble. Miller left because staying put him back inside the reach of Coop's kin and the neighbors who had watched the trial, and expected a life sentence to mean a life sentence. Even if the courts did not take him again, an angry man with a rifle could. A killer who keeps walking also keeps the advantage because movement prevents a community from pinning him down long enough to organize against him. He left his widowed mother and his siblings behind and moved west into McCulloch County. The distance was more than 100 miles, and the ride carried him through country that grew harder and more open. Timber thickened in draws and thinned on ridges. The soil changed color and the horizon stretched long enough to make a man feel small. Mesquite and cedar breaks cut the land into jagged edges. Creeks ran low and then vanished, leaving damp sand that held hoofprints until the next wind erased them. Summer heat pressed down on riders and stock until sweat dried into salt on skin and cloth, and even a short stop in shade felt like a bargain won by endurance. McCulloch County offered work to men who could ride, rope, and stay upright through long days. Ranching demanded muscle, nerve, and a willingness to face sickness, drought, stampedes, and the steady grind of chores that kept cattle alive. A hired hand was judged by output more than biography, at least until he started moving close to families who cared about reputation. A man who fixed wire, tracked strays, and handled nervous stock without losing his head could earn a wage, even if he carried a past that would have closed doors in a smaller, tighter place. Miller hired on with rancher Emmanuel D. Clements, known widely as Manon Clements. Clements was not a soft employer and not a gentle neighbor. His family name carried the kind of reputation that grew out of feuds and gunfire, and his kin included men linked to some of the most notorious violence in Texas. The Clements circle had long ties of blood and friendship to John Wesley Hardin. The Hardin name alone told strangers that this was a family accustomed to settling disputes with weapons, and a family whose enemies did not expect mercy when tensions turned into threats. Ranch life still demanded discipline even when it sat beside that kind of history. Days started in darkness and ended with sore hands. Men rode out in small groups to gather cattle, repair fences, and check water. They slept hard and woke hard. They learned to read the landscape with the same care they read another man's face. A rider who missed sign in a creek bed could lose stock. A rider who missed tension in camp could lose his life. Miller worked inside that reality. He did not need to talk much to show that he could stay in the saddle and keep up. And he did not need to tell stories about Coryell County to earn a place among men who judged by what they saw. The Clements Ranch was not an island. McCulloch County tied into a wider network of family, trade, and old grievances that reached into neighboring towns and counties. Riders carried news along roads and creek crossings, and the news often carried a single theme: who had been arrested, who had been shot, who had been seen riding with whom. In that environment, loyalty was not a word reserved for Sunday. It was currency. The man who stayed steady when trouble came earned trust, and trust opened doors that a stranger could not force. Miller moved carefully among those doors. He did not carry himself like a man begging for acceptance. He watched. He listened. He learned which men were respected and which were merely feared. He learned how people spoke when they wanted to hide something, and how they spoke when they wanted a listener to repeat their words. That skill mattered more than speed with a pistol. On the frontier, survival often depended on understanding what was being decided in another man's head before the decision became a raised voice or a hand moving toward a gun belt. At the same time, Miller built another layer of protection, the protection of respectability. He kept close to reputable citizens when it served him. He joined churches in the communities where he lived, and he cultivated friendships with men whose standing could sway a courtroom. Those relationships were not kindness, they were insurance. If he faced charges again, a row of well-dressed men could stand up and speak of him as quiet, helpful, and upright. That kind of testimony did not change what he had done, but it could change how a jury felt when deciding whether to punish him. His position with the Clements family made that strategy easier. A hired hand connected to a prominent ranch could be seen in town without suspicion rising immediately. He could attend gatherings and sit among families who valued order and church membership. He could be spoken of as settled instead of hunted. People judge what is in front of their eyes more than what is said from a distant county. And Miller gave them a calm surface to look at. He did not need to win love, he needed to win hesitation, and hesitation was often enough to keep questions quiet. Inside the Clements household, Miller grew close to Manon's son, Manny Clements. The friendship endured and mattered because it anchored Miller to a family that could offer cover and connection. It also put him within reach of Sarah Frances Clements, called Sally by her family. Miller did not need to announce a courtship as if he were seeking permission from the county. Proximity did the work. He became a familiar figure, the hired man who showed up when needed, who spoke respectfully in front of elders, and who understood how to keep his temper hidden until it served him to reveal it. That respectable surface did not erase the method that had ended John Coop's life. The Coop killing had shown a preference for advantage, not for a fair fight in the open. That preference fit neatly inside a world where feuds depended on ambushes and reprisals carried out in shadows. A ranch family used to violence did not demand that a man be honorable in a duel. It demanded that he be dependable when danger threatened the family's standing. The more Miller proved he could keep his mouth shut and his hands ready, the more he fit into a culture where silence protected killers and protected those who made use of them. Bollinger, the county seat of Runnels County, stood as a place where these pressures sometimes exploded in plain view. On March 29, 1887, Manon Clements confronted Bollinger Deputy Sheriff Joe Townsend and drew a pistol on him. That single motion forced the situation into a narrow channel. Townsend had to act or die. He killed Clements. A prominent rancher fell in a town setting where the lawman's duty could be argued in public, and where the dead man's friends could carry the story in whichever direction made vengeance feel justified. The killing did not settle the matter. It widened it. Clements had kin, and kinship carried obligations that could not be shrugged off in front of neighbors. Men talked in town and on the ranches. Some said Townsend had done what he had to do. Others said the law had been too quick, too eager, too proud. Those arguments mattered less than the emotional result. A man who carried a family name and a history of violence had been killed by a badge, and people who lived by feud rules did not let a killing like that go cold. Miller watched that tension from inside the circle that felt the loss most sharply. A hired man could not command a family's grief, but he could absorb the lesson. The law could kill a man in public and still claim legitimacy. The law could also become a target. The same shotgun that had ended John Coop's life on a porch could be turned against a lawman, and the shooter might never be named in a courtroom if the community chose silence, confusion, or fear. 7 months after the Bollinger confrontation, someone ambushed Joe Townsend with a shotgun. Townsend survived, but the damage to one arm was so severe that amputation followed. The attack carried a clear message. Revenge could reach a lawman even after a killing that the law called justified. No one was ever brought to trial for the ambush. The absence of a prosecution did not mean the act was unreal. It meant witnesses did not step forward, and the line between what people believed and what they would say under oath stayed firm. That silence did more than protect an attacker. It taught the region that a determined killer could operate inside family alliances and community fears with little risk. It also warned lawmen that their authority had limits. A badge could put a man in front of a gun, but it could not guarantee that a jury would convict the person who fired. Fear did not always speak as fear. Sometimes it spoke as forgetfulness, as a shrug, as a refusal to recognize a man seen clearly in daylight. For Miller, the years from the Coop murder through the Townsend ambush formed a chain. The first link was a killing done by buckshot in a place where a sleeping man could not fight back. The next link was a conviction that should have ended his freedom, followed by an appeal that broke the verdict. The next link was a move into a county where a notorious ranch family offered work and shelter. Then came a public shooting in Bollinger that left the family patriarch dead. After that came an ambush that left a lawman alive but maimed, and it left the courts empty of anyone willing to testify. These events changed the way a man like Miller could survive. He learned that the most important weapon was not only the gun, it was the ability to control what others believed. If he could be seen as a church member and a steady worker, he could borrow the credibility of people who had never killed anyone. If he could attach himself to a powerful name, he could make witnesses think twice before stepping into court. If he could keep his own story quiet, he could let other men argue over facts while he stayed out of reach, and he could let fear do work that a bullet did not need to do. By the time the shock of Bollinger and the fear of the Townsend ambush settled into daily talk, Miller was no longer just a drifting hand with a murder charge behind him. He was a man threading himself into a family that understood violence and could live with it. In 1888, he married Sarah Frances Sally Clements in McCulloch County. The marriage did not cleanse his past. It strengthened his position. It gave him kin who had reasons to shield him, and it gave him a respectable front that could be carried into towns where strangers asked fewer questions when a man arrived with a known family name at his side. November 4th, 1890. Reeves County chose George A. Bud Fraser as sheriff, and a hard young lawman took responsibility for a railroad town that ran on speed, noise, and nerves. Pecos stood in far west Texas on the line of the Texas and Pacific Railroad, close enough to the Pecos River for its name to feel constant on the tongue, and surrounded by open land that made distance look harmless until a rider tried to cross it. Cattle moved toward the rails, freight moved toward warehouses, money moved toward card tables. Men drifted in with no roots and no patience. Every week produced new quarrels, and arguments had room to grow fast because no one wanted to look weak in a place that measured strength with gun smoke. A Reeves County sheriff had to do more than arrest drunks and write reports. The job meant riding long miles to serve warrants, track missing stock, and pull prisoners out of ranch country where kinship often outranked law. It meant guarding a jail that any determined group could reach, and it meant walking down a street where the man standing outside a saloon was often armed, drunk, and eager to test the badge. A lawman could be right and still end up dead. Fraser understood that, and he looked for deputies who could work without hesitation, yet avoid turning every arrest into a body on the street. Finding that kind of deputy in Pecos was not simple. The work demanded day after day of discomfort, long rides, bad water, thin sleep, and the constant chance that a routine arrest would become a firefight. Some men had the nerve but not the judgment. Others had the appearance of restraint but broke when cornered. The worst candidates were the ones who wanted the badge for its access, men who liked the authority more than the duty. Fraser had to choose carefully, and even careful choices carried risk because the town attracted men who knew how to act respectable until the moment they wanted to strike. In the year after Fraser took office, Jim Miller came into Pecos and asked for work. He carried himself with deliberate restraint. He did not stagger out of saloons. He did not boast in public. He spoke to merchants with measured politeness and kept his temper leashed in front of witnesses. In a town where loudness often passed for courage, that self-control attracted attention. People who wanted calm streets interpreted his manner as discipline, and discipline was the missing ingredient they kept asking the law to bring. Miller also understood the value of visible devotion. He made sure Pecos residents saw him attend church regularly and behave as if the words mattered. He did not treat Sunday as a stage for mischief. He sat still, listened, and left without turning the front steps into a place for threats and crude laughter. He neither smoked nor drank during this period, a notable choice in a hard country where both habits were common. The nickname Deacon Jim spread because it matched what he chose to show, a man who appeared to live by Scripture while carrying a weapon with the ease of practice. The contrast worked in his favor because the town wanted to believe that a man who looked clean in a pew would keep the streets clean too. Fraser hired him as a deputy. The badge gave Miller privileges that ordinary criminals did not possess. He was able to ask questions without causing alarm. He was able to move between ranches and town under the excuse of official business. He was able to handle prisoners and control what they said, what they heard, and whether they lived long enough to reach a courtroom. In a county where a single witness could change the outcome of a murder case or a rustling investigation, control of custody carried enormous power, and it gave a deputy leverage that did not show on the surface. Deputy work also meant paperwork and process, the part of law that most gunmen ignored. Miller learned how to use warrants, affidavits, and official language to give his actions a lawful shape. When a deputy filed a report first, the report often became the truth in the public mind. A man who wanted to challenge that truth needed witnesses, and witnesses in Pecos weighed every word against personal risk. Miller understood that, and he used the authority of the written story as another weapon, one that did not make noise and did not leave powder smoke, yet could still destroy an enemy. The region around Pecos was shaped by constant border movement and constant suspicion. Mexican laborers crossed to work and trade. Rustlers and smugglers crossed to profit. Pazes and trackers crossed to recover stolen stock or chase men wanted for violence. The same roads carried honest travelers and killers, and a sheriff had to decide quickly which was which with limited information. Local prejudice often made that decision simpler and more dangerous. When stock vanished, blame fell on Mexicans first, and a lawman who fed that bias could hide his own wrongdoing behind the town's appetite for easy answers. At the same time, ranchers along the Pecos Valley began reporting heavier theft. Horses disappeared from corrals. Cattle drifted from pastures in the night and showed up later under different brands. Missing animals cut into families' ability to survive. A small ranch could not absorb repeated loss. Every stolen horse meant lost labor and lost income. Every stolen cow meant less money for feed, tools, and medicine. Theft was not a nuisance in that country, it was a threat to livelihoods, and it fed talk that the law either lacked competence or lacked honesty. Miller rode out of town often saying he was hunting thieves, yet he did not bring thieves in. Ranchers compared notes and noticed the gap between his travel and his results. They had seen competent trackers in the past, men who read sign, pushed hard, and recovered stock or prisoners. Miller returned without captives and without recovered animals. Suspicion formed the way it often formed in frontier communities, slowly at first, then openly once enough men shared the same unease. A deputy who never found a thief became an answer in himself, either incapable or involved, and Pecos had already learned not to trust incapability in a man carrying authority. Barney Riggs pressed that suspicion. Riggs was Bud Fraser's brother-in-law, a cattleman with a reputation built on violence and survival rather than polite talk. His past included a life sentence in the Arizona Territorial Prison at Yuma, followed by a pardon. That history made his opinions weighty, not because he was righteous, but because he understood how ruthless men operated and how they hid. He told Fraser that the thefts rose when Miller joined the sheriff's crew. He argued that the simplest explanation was that the deputy was part of the problem, and that the badge provided the cover. Riggs pushed for action, and action carried danger. A sheriff firing a deputy without proof invited backlash from citizens who liked the deputy and from criminals who benefited from the chaos. Fraser confronted Miller with the accusations. Miller dismissed them with calm amusement and relied on the support he had built among church members and townspeople who believed his manner proved his innocence. Fraser kept him on because he did not yet have evidence strong enough to justify a public rupture that could split the town, and because a sheriff who appeared to act on mere rumor risked losing the authority he needed to do the job at all. Then Miller killed a Mexican prisoner in custody, and the killing tightened the suspicion into something harder. The official explanation was an escape attempt. The phrasing mattered. Trying to escape turned a custody death into a justified shooting. A prisoner who died could not testify, and a dead man could not contradict the lawman's story. In the mechanics of frontier justice, a custody killing often ended the problem the lawman said he was solving, and it also ended whatever the prisoner knew. The moment a captive was dead, the whole case became whatever the deputy said it had been. Riggs said the prisoner had not been killed to stop a flight, but to silence knowledge. He claimed the captive knew where stolen mules were hidden, and that the deputy killed him to prevent the information from reaching Fraser. Riggs did not leave the accusation hanging as mere talk. He gave Fraser directions to the place where the mules were supposedly concealed. The test was simple. if the animals existed where Riggs said they were, then Miller's custody killing fit a pattern of cover and profit rather than law enforcement. Fraser rode out, followed the guidance, and found the mules. In West Texas, stolen stock was a fact that could not be argued away with sermons or handshakes. The discovery turned Riggs's suspicion into proof that at least one part of the accusation was true. Fraser fired Miller immediately. The dismissal was a public insult and a strategic act of survival. If the sheriff kept a deputy linked to hidden stolen animals, he risked losing the ranching community that depended on him. He also risked becoming a figurehead lawman in a town that was already flirting with criminal control. Miller did not leave Pecos. Losing the deputy's badge removed official authority, but it did not remove his reputation or his network. He responded by tightening the respectable performance that had protected him. He kept his language polite. He remained present in church. He avoided a public scene that would confirm every fear. In a town that watched for weakness, he refused to show panic or desperation. The restraint made him harder to confront. It allowed his supporters to keep defending him as a wronged man rather than a thief stripped of power. The town divided into camps. Some citizens treated Fraser's firing as a rescue, the sheriff cutting loose a dangerous deputy before the damage spread further. Others treated it as an overreaction, the sheriff turning on a man who had presented himself as devout and dependable. Church members who admired Miller's posture supported him because they wanted to believe piety could not coexist with predation. That belief offered Miller a shield. A man seen as a church-going family man could be accused, but he was not easily condemned by neighbors who had invested their own trust in him. Miller then moved into politics, where legitimacy could be manufactured through votes even when facts were ugly. The sheriff's office was elected. Holding that office meant controlling the jail keys, the deputies, the official accounts of violent incidents, and the ability to call posses. It meant influence over who was pursued, who was left alone, and how quickly law enforcement responded when a rancher reported theft. Miller decided he wanted that power, and he challenged Fraser in the next election, forcing the town to choose between the sheriff who fired him and the man who claimed he was punished for doing his job. The campaign sharpened every street interaction. Shopkeepers were asked where they stood. Ranch hands were pressured at saloon tables. Men watched each other's answers because in Pecos an election did not end with the ballots. It shaped how people treated each other afterward, who received help, who was ignored, and who was targeted. Even a casual statement could become a mark. A man who praised Fraser risked being remembered by Miller's friends. A man who praised Miller risked being seen by Fraser's allies as someone willing to hand law to a predator in a clean shirt. Miller's public manner during the campaign stayed controlled. He did not present himself as a loud gunman. He presented himself as a calm citizen with a family and a conscience, a man who insisted he had been treated unfairly. He leaned on the reputation he had cultivated, and he used the town's hunger for order as a weapon. Many voters cared less for legal detail than they cared for fear. Fear of theft, fear of violence, fear of being alone in an open country where help arrived late. Miller promised firmness, and he did it with the face of a man who acted like God stood behind him. In the summer of 1892, Reeves County held the sheriff's election, and Bud Fraser defeated Jim Miller. The result kept the county badge in the sheriff's hands, but it did not remove Miller's influence in town. Pecos had its own office, the city marshal, and Miller secured that post despite losing the county race. It placed him back behind a badge and gave him control over the streets where most witnesses lived and most confrontations began. The marshal could decide which arrests were made, which complaints were taken seriously, and which crimes were handled quietly or ignored entirely. Once installed as marshal, Miller began building a personal force. He drew in his brother-in-law Manny Clements, widely known as Little Mannin, and used him as a deputy. He gathered additional gunmen, some related by blood or marriage, others drawn by money and the promise of protection. In Pecos, a marshal's deputies did not always act as neutral servants of law. They often acted as an extension of the marshal's grudges and ambitions. Miller's circle made that reality visible. The men around him were not chosen for patience or restraint. They were chosen for willingness to intimidate and to strike. The effect spread quickly through daily life. A citizen who wanted to report theft now had to weigh whether the marshal's office would help or whether the complaint would be carried back to the thieves. A gambler who mouthed off at the wrong time risked more than a night in jail. A merchant who refused a favor risked seeing his store suddenly subjected to inspection and harassment. A Mexican laborer passing through town learned that the badge did not guarantee fair handling. The marshal who listened to a sermon on Sunday could decide on Monday that a captive would never reach a judge, and the official explanation would already be written. Bud Fraser watched it all with anger and calculation. A sheriff could attempt to arrest a marshal, but in Pecos that kind of move risked immediate bloodshed and political fallout. Miller had supporters who would call any action against him persecution. Fraser also knew Miller had already survived legal jeopardy through procedural failures in sympathetic communities. A premature strike without iron proof could turn Fraser into the villain and leave Miller stronger. The sheriff chose to observe, to build support among ranchers and citizens who wanted honest law, and to wait for a moment when Miller's control would expose itself in a way that could not be brushed aside. As 1892 closed, Pecos settled into a tense balance. Reeves County had a sheriff who understood the danger, and Pecos had a marshal who used respectable devotion as camouflage for predation. Ranchers watched their herds with new caution. Merchants watched the marshal's deputies move through town and measured their words. Families sat in church and tried to convince themselves that good behavior in a pew meant something outside, on a dark street where a badge and a shotgun settled disputes faster than any court. May 22, 1893. That date was later written into a conspiracy charge in Reeves County, and it matched what people in Pecos had been whispering for weeks, that the next time Sheriff George A. Bud Fraser stepped off the train, he was meant to die in front of the whole town. Pecos was young and hard, a county seat set in dry country where dust settled into every seam of clothing and the sun punished men who lingered outside. Freight wagons creaked through ruts, horses sweated under harness, and the railroad delivered strangers, mail, and trouble on the same schedule. Near the center of town sat the courthouse and the jail, close to saloons, gambling tables, and the small businesses that relied on men with money in their pockets and weapons on their hips. Jim Miller had learned how to move through that kind of place without looking like he belonged to any one crowd. He kept a black broadcloth coat on his back in all kinds of weather, and he kept his voice controlled even when he was angry. He attended church, spoke politely, and carried a badge that gave him a legal reason to go armed. Under that surface, he gathered a circle of gunmen and relatives, men who could be called on for intimidation, for theft, and for killing. Fraser left town on business in May, and the absence of the sheriff gave Miller's people room to act openly. Men tied to the criminal element pushed themselves into the middle of Pecos life. Threats were delivered without much effort. Disputes that should have ended with a warning ended with a gun being shown. Citizens who had no taste for that kind of living stopped walking at night, and some stopped leaving their homes at all unless it was necessary. The plot centered on the depot platform. Miller and his allies intended to manufacture a disturbance the moment Fraser arrived. It was meant to be loud, crowded, and confusing, the kind of scene that left witnesses unsure of what they had seen and left lawmen cautious of firing into a mass of bodies. Within that confusion, a shot would be fired in a way that could be defended later as accidental. a bullet that struck the sheriff during a staged commotion. If it worked, Pecos would be told that a public killing had no author, only bad luck, and the men behind it could keep walking the streets with the same calm faces. The most dangerous part of the plan was not the gunfire. Pecos had heard plenty of shots. The danger was the excuse that could follow. A murder dressed up as a mistake could leave the town without a clear culprit, and it could leave everyone who had kept quiet with a new reason to keep quiet again. Con Gibson was the man who stopped the plan before it began. He was a cattleman in the Pecos Valley, and he heard the details in a saloon when men talked too freely. He did not keep that knowledge to himself. He sent a warning to Fraser by wire, a short message that carried the real meaning, that the depot was being prepared as a killing ground. Fraser took the warning seriously. When the train arrived, he stepped down with Texas Rangers beside him. The platform did not turn into the staged disturbance Miller had planned. Men who expected a loose crowd faced disciplined gunmen who watched hands and controlled space. The planned confusion never got started, and with Rangers present in plain view, the would-be ambushers had no safe way to begin. Charges followed, and the names were written down in official language. Jim Miller, Emmanuel Manny Clements, and Martin Quilla Hardin. The accusation was conspiracy to murder, meaning that the state believed the three had agreed to kill the sheriff. For a brief moment, Pecos had the uncommon feeling that the law might finally put weight on Miller's circle. That feeling did not last. The three were held briefly, then released on bond. In far west Texas, court time moved slowly, and men with supporters and money often found that delay became its own protection. After the depot plot failed, Miller's people did not behave like men who expected serious consequences. They walked the streets with the same posture as before. They gathered in the same places. They continued to carry themselves as if the town belonged to them. Fraser did more than rely on local deputies. He asked for state help, and for months he kept Rangers close because he believed the condition of affairs in Reeves County required it. He lived with the expectation of assassination, not as a rumor but as a daily working assumption. When he rode out to serve papers or investigate theft, he did it knowing that men loyal to Miller could be waiting behind a stable wall or along a fence line. In that season, Pecos became a town that measured every sound. A single horse galloping after dark could send men to their windows. The slam of a saloon door could make a merchant glance toward his own gun. Even small arguments carried higher risk because everyone understood that Miller's group and Fraser's supporters were watching for weakness and watching for excuses. Fraser had to keep working inside that pressure. He moved through Pecos knowing he was watched, and he knew the watching was not harmless curiosity. He could not guard himself too openly without making himself look frightened, and he could not look relaxed without giving men an easier chance. He had to enforce the law while the very men he suspected of plotting against him stood within easy reach. Miller later lost his hold on the city office, and he did not leave town. He opened a hotel in Pecos, a place that kept him in the center of local traffic. A hotel was a respectable business on paper, and it brought him face to face with travelers, ranchers, and men passing through on the railroad. It also kept news coming to him because people talked when they ate and talked when they waited for rooms. The feud sharpened when Con Gibson was murdered in New Mexico. The killing was understood in Pecos as punishment for warning the sheriff. The story that spread back into Reeves County was that Gibson's killer was tied to Miller. Fraser could not turn the suspicion into a conviction, but the meaning was plain. A man who spoke against Miller could be hunted beyond the county line, beyond state lines, and killed where Pecos law could not reach. By then, Miller was not simply a local officer with a reputation for rough work. He was a man whose public piety and private violence were both well known, and he had survived accusations that would have ruined other men. Every time a case collapsed or stalled, his confidence grew, and the fear around him deepened. One morning in 1894, Fraser decided he would not wait for a courthouse victory that might never come. He met Miller in front of Miller's hotel, close enough that there was no doubt who was speaking to whom. Fraser did not bring a posse with warrants. He brought a revolver and the intent to settle it himself. He accused Miller in the street, calling him a thief and a murderer, and he linked the accusation to Con Gibson's death. Fraser drew and fired. Bullets struck into Miller's black coat and tore into Miller's right arm. People nearby reacted instantly, some stepping back into doorways, some ducking, some running. Miller tried to answer the gunfire left-handed because his right arm was wounded. He did not stop Fraser. Fraser kept firing with practiced speed, emptying his revolver into the center of Miller's chest in the place where a man should drop for good. Miller fell, and for a breath of time it looked finished. Fraser had shot him hard and close, and he did not linger to negotiate with anyone. Then Miller's friends hauled him to a doctor. When the coat was removed, the reason for Miller's survival became visible. Under the broadcloth, Miller had been wearing a fitted steel plate. Fraser's shots had struck where they were meant to kill, but the plate had turned the bullets. Miller was wounded and badly bruised, but he lived, and his survival immediately became part of his power. A man who was supposed to be dead and was not, became a man some citizens believed the courts could never reach. Miller spoke openly of revenge. He did not treat it as a private grudge. He made it known that he intended to kill Fraser, and he repeated it enough that the threat became part of how people measured danger in Pecos. The town split harder. Some citizens, including church people who judged a man by his Sunday conduct, continued to defend Miller because he attended services and behaved politely in public. Others, including ranchers who blamed him for theft and intimidation, wanted him gone and were furious that he had survived a lawman's bullets in the middle of the street. Fraser carried the burden of a failed killing in daylight. He had tried to end the threat and had instead produced proof that Miller came prepared to survive gunfire. In Pecos, that failure did not bring mercy from the other side. It brought more pressure. Fraser moved through town with his attention fixed on small things: men who shifted their feet, hands that disappeared under coats, a horse that was held too tightly at a hitching post. At the next election, Fraser was defeated. He left Pecos for New Mexico, looking for work and distance. The move did not end the feud. It left Miller in Pecos with the last word, still dressed in black, still protected by the hesitation he inspired in others, and still surrounded by men who would back him. Fraser returned to Pecos briefly to settle personal affairs. He could not do it quietly. In a town as small as Pecos, a familiar face was noticed quickly, and news traveled at walking speed. Miller learned he was there. Both men understood that a meeting was no longer a question of chance. It was only a question of timing. December 26, 1894. Fraser encountered Miller near a blacksmith shop, a place where men stood around the open doors while iron rang and horses shifted on their feet. Fraser carried a Winchester rifle. Miller carried a shotgun, the close-range tool he trusted. They were not far apart. There was no room for speeches, and there was no safe way for either man to pretend the other did not exist. Fraser fired first, striking Miller in the right arm and left leg. Miller did not drop. Miller tried to return fire with his left hand. Fraser pressed the advantage and fired again into Miller's chest, aiming for the heart. Even after those hits, Miller stayed on his feet. The steel plate did its work again, turning bullets that should have ended him. Witnesses watched a man take shots that should have emptied him and still remain upright. Fraser broke off and fled. He had seen Miller survive twice, and he left the scene with the knowledge that the feud could not be ended by simple bravery or by clean marksmanship. The street around the blacksmith shop held the smell of powder and the quiet shock of bystanders who understood what they had just seen. This time, the legal machinery turned against Fraser. He was arrested for the attack, treated as an accused man rather than a protector. For the people in Pecos who wanted Miller punished, it was a bitter reversal. Miller recovered again and remained in town, while the former sheriff faced court proceedings. The case was transferred to El Paso, pulling the dispute away from the streets where it had been fought, and into a place where a jury would decide whether a man could shoot in public and call it justice. Pecos did not become peaceful after that. The town became careful. Men spoke in lower voices. Citizens watched doorways. Friends chose where to sit based on who else was present. The feud had not ended. It had only moved into a new stage with the same two names attached to it and the same certainty that the next meeting could be worse than the last. March 1895. Pecos lived on a tense quiet that never fully loosened its grip. Doors still opened for business each morning, yet men stepped through those doors with guarded faces and an eye on the street. Sheriff George A. Bud Fraser was no longer the elected head of Reeves County, but his name still carried authority and his enemies still treated him as unfinished business. Jim Miller stayed close to the center of town life, dressed in black, steady in church, and publicly polite, while the people who feared him watched for the next killing like they watched for weather. Miller wanted the law to do the work for him first. He pushed an attempted murder charge against Fraser, determined to turn the last street shooting into a courtroom weapon. In West Texas, that strategy had a cold logic. A conviction could remove Fraser without Miller needing to fire another shot. It could also stain Fraser's reputation, leaving him isolated from the allies who had protected him through earlier fights. Miller understood that a verdict could be a kind of killing, not of the body, but of a man's freedom and standing. The case could not survive in Pecos without poison leaking into every corner of it. Too many jurors knew both men. Too many witnesses lived within reach of relatives who might punish them. Too many deputies had already chosen sides. To push the charge forward with any force, Miller needed a lawyer who could bring fear into the courtroom while still speaking the language of statutes and procedure. John Wesley Hardin arrived in Pecos that month as a licensed attorney. Hardin carried his own violent history like a badge that needed no metal. His connection through the Clements family made his presence feel natural inside Miller's circle, and his willingness to prosecute Fraser signaled that the feud had expanded beyond street talk and gun belts. Hardin did not come in as a gentle counselor. He came in as a man who understood how juries thought, how witnesses hesitated, and how a courtroom could be turned into another battleground. Hardin's involvement changed the temperature of the dispute. Fraser's supporters heard the news and understood that the next stage would not be decided by a single draw in the street. It would be decided by who could shape the story into something a jury would accept. In that region, a jury did not simply weigh evidence. It weighed fear, loyalty, and the private judgment of who had earned violence and who had merely suffered it. Hardin intended to drive the jury toward a simple conclusion that Fraser had attempted murder in broad daylight and should pay for it. Fraser prepared for trial as if he were preparing for an ambush because the line between the two was thin. He knew that traveling to court meant moving through spaces where a shotgun could appear from a doorway or from behind a wagon. He also knew that the men around Miller were the type who did not wait for permission when they believed a killing would settle matters. Fraser took precautions, chose his companions carefully, and kept his weapons close. His life depended on routine distrust. El Paso became the arena where the case was expected to unfold. El Paso was larger than Pecos and far less intimate, yet it was not safe. The city carried its own mixture of law, gambling, soldiers, and hard men who treated conflict as entertainment. The streets were crowded with traffic from the railroad and the border, and the saloons were packed with men who could vanish into a crowd after a shooting. Courtrooms there had distance from Pecos politics, but they also had their own pressure points, and the air around any high-profile case could tighten like a noose. Hardin traveled to El Paso and stayed there. He watched the case and watched the town, alert to how quickly a public place could turn lethal. His reputation made him visible. A famous man does not need to announce himself. His face and name do it for him. That visibility was part of his power and part of his danger. The men who hated Hardin did not need to search long to find him, and the men who feared him did not need a reason to decide that he would be easier to deal with if he were dead. August 19, 1895, Hardin went to El Paso's Acme Saloon and began playing dice. He did not leave in an argument. He did not walk out into an alley to settle a dispute face to face. Constable John Selman entered the saloon and shot Hardin from behind, killing him at the gaming table. The killing was sudden, public, and final, and it stripped Hardin's legal role from Miller's hands in a single violent second. Hardin's death did not end the attempted murder charge against Fraser, but it drained strength from it. Hardin had been more than a lawyer. He had been intimidation packaged as legal advocacy. Without him, Miller lost a figure who could stand in court and make jurors uneasy simply by existing. Miller could still hire counsel, but the edge Hardin provided, the sense that the prosecution was backed by a man who had survived decades of violence, could not be replaced. The legal struggle moved forward without delivering the punishment Miller expected. In El Paso, Fraser's case ended with a hung jury. The jurors split and unable to agree on a verdict. A hung jury in that era was not only indecision, it was a signal. It told both sides that the story had competing truths, and that persuasion mattered as much as the raw facts. Fraser had shot at Miller in the past, and jurors could view that as criminal aggression or as a hard man trying to remove a danger to the community. Another trial followed in a different venue, and Fraser was acquitted. He walked out without a conviction, and the acquittal carried a cruel clarity. The state would not remove him, and the courts were not going to deliver Miller a clean legal victory. Miller had escaped punishment for his own violence before, and he had learned to treat the justice system as something that could be bent. Now he faced the other side of that truth, that a determined man could also bend it against him, or at least slip free. For Miller, the acquittal burned because it left his enemy alive and unpunished. He did not react with a public outburst. He reacted with patient calculation, the same approach that had carried him through earlier accusations. He stayed composed in public, attended church, and kept his family life visible. Those acts were not devotion. They were insulation, a way to keep town people thinking of him as respectable while he planned an outcome that could not be spoken aloud. Fraser did not treat his freedom as proof that the danger had passed. He moved away from Pecos for stretches of time and worked where he could, but he remained tied to the area through family. Family ties create habits, and habits create predictability. A man might change towns, change employment, and change companions, yet he still returns to familiar houses and familiar faces. For a hunter who favored ambush, those returns were opportunities. Toya sat in Reeves County and lived in the shadow of the railroad. It was smaller than Pecos and rougher in its own way, a place where travelers passed through and locals watched strangers carefully. A saloon in Toya was a central room for men who wanted cards, liquor, and talk. The walls were wood, the floors were scuffed, and the air was thick with the stale breath of tobacco and sweat. At a card table, a man lowered his guard in a specific way. He focused on the game and on the men across from him, and the wider room became background noise. September 14, 1896, Bud Fraser sat at a card table in a Toya saloon dealing and playing. The game had its own rhythm. Cards were shuffled, cut, and slapped down. Coins clicked against wood. Men's voices rose and fell in short bursts, laughter, complaint, teasing, the simple sounds that made a violent town feel normal for a while. Fraser's attention narrowed the way every gambler's attention narrows, drawn into the small universe of the table. Miller entered carrying a double-barreled shotgun. He did not draw a revolver and make a show. He came with the tool designed to destroy a body at close range, the weapon that turned a man's ribs into splinters and left no time for a victim to reach for a gun. He used the saloon's swinging doors as his cover. The doors moved, creaked, and returned, a common motion that did not force instant alarm. Within that brief movement, Miller leveled the barrels. The first blast hit Fraser at the table. A shotgun at that distance does not wound neatly. It tears and crushes with a brutal, spreading force. The buckshot struck with enough violence to rupture flesh and bone and to throw the body backward. Men at the table saw the impact in a bright instant of shock, then the immediate aftermath, blood spraying, cards tumbling, chairs scraping as bodies tried to recoil. Miller fired the second barrel without pause. The second blast completed the killing with gruesome certainty. Fraser's head and face were destroyed in front of the men who had been playing with him, leaving nothing that could be mistaken for survivable injury. The room filled with the sharp smell of burnt powder and the metallic smell of fresh blood. Shouts broke out. Someone screamed. Others went silent, stunned, hands frozen in midair as their minds tried to grasp the speed of what had happened. Fraser collapsed at the table. Cards and money scattered across the floor. Men shoved away from the scene and groped for weapons, then hesitated because a shotgun in a calm man's hands changes the math. A man with a pistol might be challenged. A man with a double-barreled shotgun at close range could kill 2 people in seconds and still keep others pinned with the threat of what came next. The saloon's noise changed from casual chatter to urgent confusion, and no one could pull it back. Miller did not linger to deliver speeches. He did not argue with the witnesses. He had not come for conversation. He had come to end a life in a way that left no room for a third shootout. No room for a steel plate to interfere. No room for Fraser to run. With the barrels empty and the statement made, he turned and left with controlled steps, using calm as a shield. Panic invites pursuit. Control discourages it. Men watched him go, and their fear did the work of clearing him a path. Outside, the news tore through Toya. Gunfire in a small town draws people like a magnet, and a shotgun blast draws them faster. Men rushed toward the saloon, slowed as they saw the faces of those leaving, then pushed forward again as the words reached them. Bud Fraser is dead. The phrase moved through the crowd like a physical force. It carried relief for some, dread for others, and the certainty that a long feud had just spilled into the open in the most public way possible. Fraser's sister confronted Miller soon afterward, driven by grief and rage. She approached him with a gun, and the confrontation drew attention because everyone understood what it meant. It was the most direct human response to a killing, a family member trying to answer a murder with another shot. Miller did not flinch. He threatened to kill her as well if she tried. The threat was not shouted in hysteria. It was delivered as practical warning, and it worked. Even in a frontier town, a woman challenging a known killer could be stopped by the simple certainty that he meant what he said. Miller was arrested and indicted for Fraser's murder. The paperwork mattered because it showed the state still insisted on procedure, even when a killing felt like an expected ending. Yet indictment did not equal punishment in Miller's world. He had built relationships with men who would testify to his good behavior. He had cultivated an image of religious respectability. He had survived earlier cases that should have ended him in prison or in a grave. He went into the legal process with experience, not confusion. The trial centered on the simplest fact: Fraser had been killed at a card table and Miller had been there with a shotgun. The defense aimed to widen the story until the killing felt like the last act of a mutual war rather than a cold ambush. Jurors heard of the history between the two men, the earlier attacks, the years of threats, and the moments when Fraser had fired on Miller in the street. The argument was clear. Fraser had tried to kill Miller more than once, and the feud had been violent on both sides. Witnesses described what they saw inside the saloon, but their testimony carried invisible weight. Every witness knew that speaking too clearly could bring retaliation. Every witness also knew that staying vague could keep them alive. Fear does not always look like trembling hands. Sometimes it looks like softened language, uncertain memory, and a reluctance to look directly at the most important details. A jury might never hear the full, sharp truth of a killing if the people who saw it decided their families mattered more than a verdict. When the verdict came, Miller was acquitted. The acquittal landed like a blow to the idea that law meant protection. It told ranchers, merchants, and laborers that a man could kill a former sheriff in front of multiple witnesses and still walk out free if he had the right story and the right support. It also told Miller's enemies that the court system could not be trusted to remove him, which forced them to live with him or decide on their own forms of response. Miller left the courtroom alive and unpunished, carrying the same controlled posture that had become part of his survival. His victory was more than a legal outcome. It was proof that he could shape the world around him. Men who might have testified against him in later cases remembered that a jury had refused to punish him for a saloon killing. Men who might have challenged him in public remembered that Fraser had tried and failed to end him twice, and that Fraser was now dead. The message spread without needing to be spoken, that a professional killer could wear respectability like armor and still win. March 10th, 1904. Fort Worth, Texas was already noisy before breakfast. Street traffic scraping past storefronts, wagons creaking under freight, men calling to each other in quick, rough voices. Yet beneath the city's routine there was the steady knowledge that someone could be hunted to death inside the same blocks where church bells rang on Sunday. Fort Worth was large enough to swallow strangers without comment. A man could arrive by rail, rent a room, eat in a dining house, and be gone again before a clerk learned his full name. That size attracted every kind of person the frontier produced. Cattle hands fresh off a drive, gamblers chasing luck, laborers seeking wages, and men who carried grudges the way other men carried tools. In smaller towns, enemies were recognized the moment they stepped onto a boardwalk. In Fort Worth, an enemy could stand 10 feet away and still look like nobody. Jim Miller understood the advantage of that anonymity. He also understood that his past had taught him a method that worked. Avoid public duels, avoid speeches, avoid the kind of violence that gave a victim a chance to fire back and gave witnesses a clean story to repeat. He preferred a killing that arrived like a door slamming, loud, sudden, and finished before a man could even decide whether he was awake or dreaming. He had practiced the calm face that made people hesitate. He had practiced the slow walk that made bystanders doubt their own instincts, because a man who looks unhurried does not look guilty to people who want to keep their lives simple. On that March day, a man named T.D. Frank Four was alive in Fort Worth. Four had a reputation for speaking directly, and he had become entangled in disputes that reached back toward West Texas. In a region where lawsuits and criminal cases often depended on one or two men willing to swear to what they had seen, a man with a blunt mouth could become a target. A rival might forgive an insult in a saloon, but a rival did not forgive testimony that threatened property, power, or freedom. The killing came without the ritual of a street showdown. Four was shot to death with a shotgun in Fort Worth on March 10th. The weapon mattered because it matched the kind of violence Miller had used before. A shotgun at close range did not leave the tidy single wound of a revolver. It tore flesh in a wide, violent pattern, broke bone, and turned a room into a scene that forced witnesses to remember the sound and the smell as much as the sight. Powder smoke lingered. The air tasted bitter. People who rushed in after the blast stepped into a space that no longer felt like a room for living. It felt like a room that had been used for slaughter. In the minutes that followed, the city responded the way cities respond when a killing happens indoors. First with confusion, then with urgency, then with a rush to assign names. Somebody had seen a figure moving away. Somebody had heard a voice earlier. Somebody knew which arguments had been simmering in back rooms. Police officers and deputies gathered statements that did not line up neatly. Because fear makes memory cautious. And because a murderer who acts by surprise often leaves little for honest witnesses to grab hold of. Miller's name surfaced in that early talk because his reputation traveled with him. Men in the cattle and railroad world recognized patterns the way ranchers recognized brands. They had heard of the black-coated man who attended church and still left bodies behind. They had heard of the West Texas sheriff feud that ended with a shotgun at a card table. They had heard of a man who survived gunfire because he prepared for it. Even in a city, those stories mattered. Investigators did not need a newspaper headline to learn which names caused people to lower their voices. Miller was arrested and charged with Forey's murder. Being placed under arrest in a city was not like being arrested in a small county seat where every bystander knew the accused man's family. In Fort Worth, the jail held strangers from many places. The corridors echoed with footsteps and metal doors. The air carried sweat, disinfectant, and the rancid smell of men who had slept on hard benches. Deputies watched prisoners with tired eyes because they had watched too many before, and they knew that violence did not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrived with a calm face and patient hands. Miller did not panic under that confinement. He had already seen how an accusation could collapse. He had already learned that a courtroom did not run on certainty alone. It ran on what could be proven, on what witnesses were willing to say in public, and on whether a jury believed the state's story more than it believed the defense. He presented the same controlled surface he had used for years: polite speech, steady posture, a refusal to be baited into anger. The calm was not innocence. It was strategy, because a prosecutor who could paint him as a wild, reckless brute had an easier time convincing jurors that he acted without restraint. When the case reached the stage where it needed witnesses who could fix the killing to a specific hand, the familiar frontier problem appeared again. Some witnesses could describe a sound and a moment, but not a face. Others had seen something useful and chose to soften it. In that era, a witness did not merely fear courtroom embarrassment. A witness feared a long ride taken by the wrong man at the wrong time, a figure stepping out of darkness near a gate, a shotgun muzzle lifted at chest level. Those fears did not need to be spoken in a threat. They lived in the shared knowledge that killers had friends and friends could carry out punishments without ever admitting why. The result was that the Fort Worth case did not deliver the clean ending many hoped for. The state could charge him, but it could not crush him. The proceedings did not produce a punishment that removed him from circulation. Miller remained free afterward, and that survival became another lesson, not only for him, but for the people who watched. A man could be named in a city murder, held, and still walk back into daylight if the case could not be pinned down with the kind of proof that overcame fear. That freedom did not calm him. It sharpened his usefulness to a particular kind of employer. In the late 19th century and the early years of the 20th, disputes over cattle, land, political offices, and personal grudges created a market for violence that did not look like robbery. Men wanted rivals removed without exposing themselves. They wanted a killing that appeared random, a roadside ambush, a sudden indoor shooting that left no obvious employer. A hired killer offered distance. The man who wanted the job done could stay home, keep his hands clean in public, and let an outsider take the risk. Miller fit that role because he did not rely on drunken impulse. He relied on planning and on the confidence that he could keep moving. His church reputation, carried from place to place, gave him a strange cover. Some people resisted believing a man who sat in a pew could also take payment to kill. Others believed it and still hesitated to say so aloud, because accusing a deacon of murder sounded like slander, and slander in frontier country was punished with a gun just as quickly as any other accusation. He made Memphis, Texas, in Hall County, his steady address, a panhandle railroad town where the wind carried grit through every crack and the flat land made riders visible for miles. The town's rhythm was plain: trains arriving, ranch wagons coming in for supplies, school children moving past storefronts, and Sunday services gathering families who wanted order in a country that often refused to provide it. Miller put himself in that Sunday world. He attended church and held the position of deacon, and he used that role as proof of respectability whenever anyone questioned his past or his movements. That settled life formed a shield. A man with a church role in a known household did not look like a roaming killer to people who preferred simple categories. When Miller walked down the street in Memphis, he did it as a familiar figure, not as a stranger with blood on his hands. The same neighbors who would have pointed at an obvious outlaw hesitated with him because hesitation felt safer than accusation. That hesitation affected everything, from how rumors were repeated to how witnesses spoke when officers asked questions. His appearance helped him. He dressed neatly. He kept himself restrained in conversation. He did not swagger like a saloon bully looking for a fist fight. That made him less likely to be challenged immediately. It also made him the kind of man a community might trust with small responsibilities: escorting a prisoner, guarding property, handling a local dispute, tasks that put him close to information and close to targets. Respectability opened doors. Those doors led to knowledge, and knowledge led to opportunity. When he traveled, he used the same infrastructure that moved cattle and mail, rail lines, wagon roads, and the predictable stops where a man could water horses or buy a meal. Those routes made it possible to arrive with little notice and leave before suspicion gathered into a posse. A killing committed by an outsider often produced a frantic search for a local enemy, because towns instinctively looked inward first. That instinct protected a traveling killer. While citizens argued over which neighbor might be responsible, the outsider was already miles away, eating in a different town with the same calm face. The violence that followed him in these years carried a particular kind of brutality. It was not the wild desperation of a man caught stealing. It was the blunt practicality of someone paid to end a life. There was no warning duel, no shouted argument, no chance for a target to negotiate. The goal was not to prove courage. The goal was to remove a person with speed and finality, then leave behind confusion, grief, and fear that would keep witnesses quiet. Miller's choice of weapons matched that goal. A shotgun was not elegant, yet it was decisive. At close range, it did not require precision in the way a pistol did. It also produced injuries that were difficult for any doctor of the time to treat. The killing became final fast, and a fast killing reduced the chance that a victim could identify an attacker in his last minutes. In a courtroom, that mattered. A dying declaration could be powerful. A dead man who never spoke again left the story to the living, and the living were often afraid. He also relied on preparation when he expected retaliation. He had learned through hard experience that enemies sometimes struck first and asked questions later. Protection worn under a coat changed that equation. It did not prevent pain, and it did not stop every bullet, yet it could turn a lethal strike into a survivable one. A man who survived an attempted killing gained a reputation that became its own shield. People who might have challenged him began to wonder whether it was even possible to finish him. As the years moved forward, Miller's name became a warning passed privately from one person to another. Ranchers told each other to guard their words in public. Men who carried grudges were told to be careful about hiring strangers to deliver threats, because threats could be repeated and could invite attention. Lawmen learned to watch the quiet man in decent clothes because the loudest drunk in a saloon was not always the most dangerous person in the room. Communities that wanted peace often discovered that their own habits undermined peace. People wanted to avoid trouble, so they avoided speaking to investigators. They wanted to avoid retaliation, so they chose vague testimony. They wanted to go back to work and stop thinking about death, so they allowed cases to fade into rumor. That reluctance created space for professional violence. A hired killing did not have to be invisible. It only had to be hard enough to prove that a jury could be made to hesitate. Miller used that hesitation. He did not need universal support. He needed enough uncertainty to break a case. If a juror could be persuaded that the state had not met its burden, then the verdict could lean toward acquittal. If a witness could be pressured into softness, then the story could be blurred. If a town could be made to doubt its own eyes, then a killer could keep walking. The practical consequence was that the violence around him began to feel like a business. A man would anger the wrong faction, then he would be warned, then he would be killed, and afterward people would talk in careful tones about who might have hired the job. Those tones rarely became affidavits, they rarely became sworn testimony, they remained the kind of talk that hardened fear without producing convictions. And fear was the fertilizer that allowed the next killing to grow. By the end of 1904, Miller had become more than a man with a notorious history. He had become a tool for other men's ambitions. Employers who feared exposure sought someone who could do the killing and carry the risk. Miller's calm public face and his willingness to use ruthless methods made him attractive to those employers. His survival in earlier cases proved to them that he might escape punishment again. That belief alone could convince a desperate man to gamble on him. The road ahead led him deeper into the shifting jurisdictions of Indian Territory and Oklahoma, where court systems were crowded, lines of authority were changing, and towns were growing fast enough that old patterns of silence could travel with new populations. In that country, a killer who knew how to exploit confusion could operate for years, and the consequences of one contract killing could ripple outward into a chain of reprisals that no judge could fully untangle. Wednesday, the first day of August, 1906. Ben Collins rode toward his own place in the fading light, with the day's heat still trapped in the red dirt and the tall grass, and with the kind of quiet that made every hoofbeat sound too loud. The country south and east of the Chickasaw towns was not gentle ground for a lawman who had made enemies and kept making them. Collins had worked as an Indian policeman and then as a deputy United States Marshal, and he had built a reputation on doing the job the way it had to be done in a district that swallowed weak men. He served warrants on men who lived with guns in their hands, hauled prisoners through stretches of road where help did not exist, and walked into places where everyone knew his name and half the room hoped it would become a grave marker. The trouble that followed him had a shape and a family name. 3 years earlier, Collins had shot Pote Pruitt during an arrest and left him crippled. Pote's brothers, Henry and Clint, carried that injury like a flag, and they carried their hate with the same stubborn pride. In the months that followed, the talk in and around Orr and the nearby settlements turned into something colder than talk. Men made declarations in public. Names were passed, money was promised. Collins heard the warnings, and he kept working anyway because that was the habit he had built and the only way he knew to live. That Wednesday had started like a day that could be survived. Collins had left his home early, moving along familiar tracks that cut between farms and timber, and he had gone to Emmett, the nearest little center of life, mail and talk. 2 roads ran between his place and Emmett, one known locally as the East Road and the other as the West Road, and those names mattered later when witnesses tried to rebuild the evening like men laying boards over a hole. As the sun went down, the roads filled with the small movements of a rural evening. A hired man named Jasper Jones was at Collins's place. Neighbors were finishing their chores. A few people were at church. Wagons creaked. Dogs barked at shadows and then went quiet. In that ordinary life, Collins's name still carried weight, and it carried danger. That same afternoon, a man named A. Washmood had been moving in the country around Emmett on insurance business. He had been at hotels, hired teams, and driven out to see people who could pay premiums and sign papers. He had also made contact with Collins in the days before, sharing drinks and talking business. The friendly surface of those visits meant nothing once the killing began, but it mattered to the men who later tried to understand how Collins ended up where he died. Near sundown and into dark, Washmood drove a buggy toward Collins's house. At the gate and along the fence line, the land narrowed into a place where a man could be trapped without even knowing it. The gate was a hinge point between open road and home ground. A rider had to slow, a man had to shift his weight, a horse had to obey. That moment of hesitation was all an assassin needed. Collins on horseback came along that road toward home. He had the posture of a man returning to his own yard, but he did not have the safety of a man returning to a guarded place. He was not riding into town with other officers. He was not walking into a room where people were watching his back. He was coming to a gate at night, with the dark settling, and with his family inside. The ambush came at close range with a shotgun. The first blast tore into him hard enough to drop the ordinary shape of a man into a mangled struggle. It was not a clean killing, and it was not a duel. It was a murder done the way professional killers did it, with brute force and no chance for the victim to bargain with distance. Collins still fought. He got his pistol into play. He fired back, not with the calm of a man in control, but with the desperate muscle memory of someone who had fought for his life before and refused to lay down even when the body began to fail. A second shotgun blast finished what the first had started. When neighbors later spoke of the killing, the details that stayed with them were the details that belonged to the land itself: the fence corner, the gate, the way the sound of gunfire carried in the night air. People heard shots around 9 o'clock. Some heard a buggy pass later, moving fast, the voices of 2 men in it, the wheels cutting the road like they were trying to outrun their own crime. A treetop lay across the road and the buggy hit it. It was a small accident in the middle of a murder, but it marked the flight with a sound, a jolt, and a moment of panic. When the killing became known, the scene at Collins's home shifted from private life to public violence. The night drew men from nearby places, men who knew what it meant when a deputy marshal was found dead at his own gate. His wife faced the thing no family could prepare for: the sudden knowledge that her children's father was not coming back, and the additional knowledge that he had been taken in the one place he should have been safe. At daylight, men looked for what killers always left behind when they rushed: empty shells, tracks, and the small scraps of evidence that could be carried into court if witnesses lived long enough to speak. Shotgun shells were found near the corner of the fence by the gate where Collins had been killed. The placement mattered. It meant the killer had chosen that exact spot and had waited there. It meant the murder was planned, not a quarrel that erupted. The ground told that truth even before any person testified. The next question was who had hired the gun and who had guided it. In the talk that followed, the Pruitt name rose quickly. So did the name Jim Miller. People already knew the pattern Miller belonged to. They knew the kind of man who could sit through church with clean clothes and then step into night work with a shotgun, a pistol, and a price. They knew the kind of man who could say he killed for God and still take money for murder like a tradesman collecting wages. In the days after the killing, arrests began, the early moves of a system trying to prove itself stronger than the fear that clung to every witness. Washmood was arrested the morning after the murder, picked up in the same country where Collins had lived and worked. Officers tried to track movements through towns like Tishomingo, Milburn, and Emmett, and through the roads that connected them. Every stop a suspect had made became important. Every hotel conversation, every hired team, every place a man could have met the wrong person and made the wrong agreement. The case did not stay simple. It never could. The Indian Territory courts and the later Oklahoma courts were built to handle crime, but they were not built to handle a region where witnesses could be threatened into silence and where killers could be paid to erase testimony. The law could pull a man into custody, but it could not stop his allies from working the edges of the case, stalling it, confusing it, and wearing down the courage of people who had to live on the same roads the accused still traveled. The government brought indictments that year, naming men in a conspiracy that was supposed to explain the killing as more than a single trigger pull. Collins had enemies, but the prosecution aimed to show a coordinated plan, a combination of brothers seeking revenge, hired killers offering results, and local helpers offering access. The names included members of the Pruitt family and men tied to Miller. The goal was to make the killing of a deputy marshal into a case that could not be shrugged off as frontier misfortune. The legal fight was slow and ugly. Defense lawyers poked holes in the chain between talk and action. They attacked witness credibility. They argued that statements made by the Pruitts were not proof of agreement by every man whose name appeared on paper. They pushed for changes of venue and leaned on technical weaknesses in a system that had been reshaped by statehood and by the transfer of territorial cases into state courts. While papers moved between places, the human reality kept turning darker. The region did not forget that a deputy marshal had been murdered at his own home, and it did not forget the names of the men accused of arranging it. Fear had a practical shape, because people remembered what happened to those who stood in the way of professional killers. The effect on law enforcement was immediate. Every deputy understood that a badge did not protect a man at a gate. It only made him more valuable as a target. The case also fed a different hunger, the hunger for a faster kind of justice. Communities across the territory and the new state had lived for years with the sight of killers walking free on technicalities, or beating charges through intimidation, or slipping away while witnesses disappeared. Each time the legal system failed, the appeal of mob law grew stronger. That appeal did not require careful proof. It required only conviction, rage, and enough men willing to pull rope. Even while the Collins case brewed, the atmosphere around Jim Miller grew hotter. He had long used the same armor, a calm surface, a reputation for religion, and the cold logic of doing paid killings with minimal risk. But the work left a trail of bodies that did not fade. The Collins murder made that trail harder to ignore, because the victim was not a gambler or a drifter or a man without friends. He was a lawman known for his work, and his death touched every deputy in the region. In the months after Collins was killed, the legal machinery strained under its own limits. Witnesses were scattered, some by fear and some by the simple movement of people across county lines and state lines. Time itself became a weapon. Every delay meant memories blurred, and every blur made reasonable doubt easier to build. Yet the murder did not disappear. Collins's name stayed in conversation. His wife and children lived with the aftermath, the absence, the danger that came with being connected to a man whose enemies had proven they would strike at home. Neighbors who had once seen Collins riding the district now saw an empty space where that authority had been. That void mattered. In communities like Emmett, Orr, and the surrounding farms, the badge was not a symbol. It was a working tool. When the tool was broken, everyone felt the weakness. The Collins killing also reinforced a lesson that shaped the Old West as it became something else. The era of open street gunfights was not the only kind of violence. The territory had its share of loud shootouts, but the more chilling danger was the quiet assassination, the man in a fence corner with a shotgun, the hired killer who treated murder as a job and used patience as a weapon. That style of violence did not end when towns gained telephones and better roads. It adapted. As the years moved toward the next crisis, the anger that had formed around the Collins case did not cool. It waited. It simmered in courthouse hallways, in livery stables, in back rooms where men talked in low voices about what should happen to killers who used religion as cover and money as motive. The people who wanted formal justice kept pressing forward, but the people who wanted a rope kept listening for the next outrage. The killing of Ben Collins did not finish Jim Miller. It did something more important in the long run. It narrowed his space to hide. It tied his name to a murdered lawman in a way that could not be laughed off. It gave ordinary men a clear picture of what he was, a hired assassin who could stand in the same world as his victims, then reduce them to bleeding ruin at their own gate. By the time the season turned and the case continued its grinding path through indictments, transfers, and testimony, the ground under Miller had changed. The town's patience, already thin from years of killers escaping punishment, had been cut again. Collins's blood had soaked into the dirt at the fence corner, and it had soaked into the public mind with the same stubborn permanence. The next killing would not be treated as just another violent episode on the frontier. It would be treated as proof that the system could not stop Miller. Saturday, the 29th day of February 1908, Pat Garrett rode out from Las Cruces, New Mexico in a wagon with Carl Adamson. And before the morning was over, the man who had once hunted Billy the Kid lay dead beside the road. The country east of Las Cruces was open, pale, and harsh, with scrub and sand that looked empty until a person had to cross it on foot. The road cut through arroyos and low rises with long sight lines that made it easy to see someone coming, and just as easy for an ambush to be staged where a wagon had to slow. Garrett was not riding as a celebrated lawman surrounded by deputies. He was traveling through a dispute over land, leases, and goats, the kind of argument that sounded small until it started costing money and pride. Wayne Brazel, the man leasing Garrett's ranch for a goat operation, appeared along the route. Words were exchanged. The argument tightened. Then shots cracked in that open air. Garrett was hit hard, first in the back of the head, then again as he went down. In a place with no crowds and no quick help, a killing did not need many seconds to become permanent. The wagon, the road, and the sparse vegetation became the only witnesses that could not be intimidated later. Brazel surrendered afterward, and official processes began the way they often began in the Southwest, quickly, with men writing down the first version of the story they could secure. A coroner's jury named Brazel as the shooter. A courtroom later heard Brazel claim self-defense, and he was acquitted. Those documents and outcomes established a basic legal truth. The case ended without a conviction, and Brazel walked free. Legal truth and public belief did not match. Garrett had enemies in New Mexico, and he had enemies in Texas, and his death arrived at a time when rumor was already filling the gaps left by weak evidence. People asked why Adamson had been present, why the only living eyewitness did not appear at the trial, why the killing took place in a spot that seemed built for it, and why a man like Garrett could be ended so efficiently on a routine trip. Each question pulled a little more suspicion into the open, and in frontier culture, suspicion did not need to be proven to become dangerous. Names began to circulate as alternative killers. W. Cox was mentioned because of disputes tied to ranch land and goats. Carl Adamson was mentioned because he was there and because he did not carry the burden of a public testimony afterward. Print Road was suggested later by some writers. Then Jim Miller's name surfaced, carried by the reputation he had earned across Texas. the reputation of a calm, church-going figure who used a shotgun the way other men used a hammer. The connection that fed the rumor was personal. Adamson had family ties to Miller through Miller's wife, Sally. That kinship did not prove anything on its own, but it gave the rumor a shape that people could hold in their hands. In the saloons and hotel lobbies where men traded stories for entertainment and warning, it sounded plausible to them that an assassin could be brought in from Texas, do the work, and vanish back across the line while local men argued over who had fired the gun. Miller did not have to be present at the scene for the shadow to touch him. His career had made him the kind of figure people used to explain murders that felt too clean. He had already survived accusations and trials that should have ended him. He had already been linked to the killing of lawmen. He had already proven that he could move between towns and still find defenders who spoke of his Sunday manners. Once a man becomes that kind of symbol, his name gets used even when hard proof is missing because people want a villain who makes sense. For Miller, the danger was not only the law, it was the attention. A professional killer survives by avoiding a crowd that is unified against him. He does not need everyone to like him, but he cannot afford for too many people to agree that he is the center of every violent mystery. Attention draws investigators. Attention draws newspaper writers. Attention draws the kind of citizens who start talking about ropes when juries fail. Back in Texas, Miller stayed planted in the posture he had practiced for years. He lived in Memphis, kept his public image neat, and remained visible in church life, the same way he had done before. That visibility served a purpose. A man who is seen regularly in one place has an alibi in the loose social sense. Neighbors can say he was in town, he was at services, he was at home. The statements might not hold up to strict cross-examination, yet they still create doubt, and doubt is a tool in any case built on rumor. At the same time, the world Miller moved through was tightening. Indian Territory had become the state of Oklahoma in the fall of 1907, and that change brought new courts, new sheriffs, and new political pressure to prove the state could control violence. The same old patterns of intimidation still existed, but there was also a growing impatience with killers who exploited technicalities and silence. Towns wanted prosperity. Prosperity required stability. Stability required that notorious men stop walking free. The Ben Collins case still hovered near Miller's name as well. Collins had been murdered at his own gate with a shotgun, and the killing had been treated as a hired ambush tied to revenge. That pattern looked too familiar to too many lawmen. Even when prosecutions stalled or fell short, the suspicion stayed. Deputies and marshals began to treat Miller as more than a single criminal. They treated him as a traveling source of contract violence. Newspapers and word of mouth did what they always did. They stitched separate crimes into a single narrative. A man who wanted to believe the world had order found it easier to accept that one notorious killer stood behind multiple murders than to accept that violence was simply everywhere and often untraceable. Garrett's death, with its disputed circumstances and its acquittal, fed that hunger for a single answer, and Miller's reputation made him an easy candidate. That reputation also made him useful to other men. When a community believes someone can kill without consequence, that belief becomes a kind of advertisement. Men with grudges begin to ask how to reach him. Men who want a rival gone start to look for introductions. The danger grows because the killer does not need to search for work. Work comes looking for him, carried by whispers and the exchange of names at the edges of respectable life. Miller's calm in public did not mean his life was calm in private. His marriage had anchored him, but it also tied him to extended kin networks that carried their own conflicts. His business and travel put him in contact with men who did not discuss disputes with lawyers first. In that world, a contract killing could begin as a quiet conversation, a man explaining why another man had to go, followed by the mention of money and the name of someone who could handle it cleanly. As 1908 turned into 1909, the center of gravity shifted toward Ada, Oklahoma, a growing town in Pontotoc County. Ada was not a remote camp. It was a place with merchants, civic groups, churches, and a population that wanted to see itself as modern. That desire to appear orderly did not remove violence, but it made violence more offensive when it erupted. A lawless killing in a developing town threatened property values, threatened business confidence, and threatened the sense that the community was moving forward instead of sliding back. Gus Bobbitt lived near Ada and carried his own history of law enforcement work, including service as a deputy United States Marshal. He was not a drifter with no ties. He had standing and familiarity among people who mattered. That standing also meant he had enemies, because in a region where lawmen made arrests that ruined reputations and sent men to prison, those men and their families did not always accept the outcome as finished business. The conflicts around Bobbitt were rooted in money, land, and personal resentment, the usual fuel that turned ordinary disagreements into threats. Men in Ada argued over transactions and obligations, and in those arguments a lawman's influence could become a problem. A man who felt blocked by Bobbitt did not always have the patience to wait for civil remedies. He might instead look for the kind of solution that left Bobbitt unable to speak, unable to testify, unable to interfere. That is where Miller's name entered the Ada talk. It did not enter as a rumor tied to distant New Mexico. It entered as a practical possibility. Men who believed they could control a situation by removing Bobbitt began searching for someone who could do it without hesitation. They did not want a reckless drunk who might brag afterward. They wanted someone with a reputation for controlled violence, someone who had already walked away from trials and accusations. Miller's pattern fit the need. He traveled. He stayed quiet. He used a shotgun for close-range certainty, and he had long practiced the habit of keeping his public face clean enough that some people doubted he could do what he was accused of doing. In an environment where juries struggled to convict without clear witnesses, that ability to generate doubt was as valuable as the weapon itself. While Ada's local tensions grew sharper, Miller's wider shadow continued to trail him. The Garrett controversy remained alive, discussed in print and in private. Some people treated Brazel as the shooter and left it there. Others treated the acquittal as one more example of a system failing to deliver closure. The disputed identity of the killer kept the story open, and as long as it stayed open, Miller's name remained part of the list that people repeated. Miller handled that kind of shadow by refusing to react publicly. A man who protests too loudly invites scrutiny. A man who stays composed lets the talk burn itself out, or at least lets it become background noise. He continued living as a respectable figure in Memphis, and he continued moving when he chose, without announcing where he was going or why. Yet the frontier was shrinking. Railroads and telegraph lines made distance less protective than it had once been. Newspapers made reputations portable. A killing in one state could be discussed in another within days, and a suspect's name could cross county lines faster than he could ride. For a hired killer, the only way to survive in that changing environment was to depend even more heavily on speed, silence, and the willingness of frightened people to keep their mouths shut. By early 1909, the Ada job, the one that would soon stain the town permanently, was no longer a vague idea in back rooms. It became a plan with names attached, men who believed they had enough money and enough influence to set it in motion. They believed that if they chose the right assassin, Bobbitt would die, and the legal system would still fail to deliver a conviction, just as it had failed in so many earlier cases across the region. Friday, the 26th day of February 1909. Miller moved into the Ada area under that rising pressure, carrying the same quiet confidence that had kept him alive through years of accusations and stepping into a town that would soon decide it was finished relying on courts. Saturday, the 27th day of February 1909, Alan Augustus Gus Bobbitt drove out of Ada with a wagon load of cottonseed meal, and he never reached his barn. Ada was growing fast enough that people talked of progress, new businesses, better roads, and a town future that depended on order. Outside town, the country still offered the old cover, fence lines, timber, and dirt lanes where a man could be isolated and killed without a crowd seeing it. Bobbitt lived in that outer ring. He had once served as a deputy United States Marshal. He was known as a determined officer, and he had carried old feuds that never cooled. One of those feuds was with Jesse West and Joe Allen, men whose earlier clashes with him had ended with their removal from the area, and whose bitterness had not gone quiet with distance. On that Saturday, Bobbitt handled a rancher's errand that could not wait. He bought 2 wagon loads of cottonseed meal for his stock. He drove one loaded wagon himself. Behind him, a neighbor he had hired for the trip, Bob Ferguson, followed in a second wagon carrying the other load. They took the Ada to Roff Road, heading southwest out of town. The teams worked steadily, harness leather straining, wheels grinding over ruts, and the winter sun sliding toward the horizon. Along the road, they met a rider. The rider looked respectable, well-dressed, wearing a tie and a riding cap. The horse under him did not match the clothes. It was a brown farm mare, worn-looking with markings distinctive enough that Ferguson took note without trying. The rider passed them without greeting or delay. Neither Bobbitt nor Ferguson recognized him. They kept moving, focused on the load and the miles left before dark. After they had traveled 6 miles, Bobbitt and Ferguson reached the turnoff to Bobbitt's place. They turned into the lane, a narrower track bordered by fences and trees. Wagons had to slow there. Teams had to be guided carefully because a mistake could put a wheel into a ditch or snag a hub on a fence corner. The lane ran toward the ranch house, and a half-mile before the buildings, a large oak tree stood close enough to the track to hide a man behind its trunk. Jim Miller waited behind that oak with a double-barreled shotgun. Both hammers were cocked. He had chosen the spot because the lane forced the wagons close and because dusk would cover movement. When Bobbitt's wagon drew even with the tree, Miller stepped out and fired twice. The blasts hit with the crushing spread of close-range buckshot. 26 pellets struck Bobbitt, tearing into his leg and above his hip. He shouted, "Oh, God!" and fell out of the wagon onto the ground. The team bolted, dragging the wagon forward without its driver. Dust rose and hung low over the lane as the wheels rattled away. Ferguson was not hit. He saw the shooter clearly enough to know the attack was planned, and the killer was armed for more than one shot. He kept his distance, holding himself and his team back because a witness killed at the scene would leave no one to describe what happened. Miller ran in with a pistol drawn to check the result. Bobbitt was still alive, writhing in pain, blood running into the dirt. Miller did not fire again into him there. He turned away, ran to his horse, and galloped off. As he fled, he threw the shotgun into a nearby stream, stripping himself of the most obvious weapon link. Ferguson moved fast once the shooter was gone. He unhitched a horse from his own wagon, caught Bobbitt's runaway team, and drove toward the house. In rural country, help depended on distance, and distance depended on speed. He reached the ranch house, alerted Bobbitt's wife, Tennessee, and went to the telephone to call a doctor and the law. Tennessee had already heard the shots. She ran to the lane and found her husband where he lay near the oak. His clothing was ripped and soaked. His leg and hip were shattered by pellets. He asked her to put his head in her lap, and she did, holding him while he fought for breath. The pain showed in every movement, the shaking, the sweat, the way his hands clawed at the ground as if he could steady himself by force. Bobbitt spoke in short, strained phrases. He told Tennessee that old enemies were responsible, and in the names that carried meaning in the area, that pointed toward West and Allen. He did not have time to turn it into a formal statement. He was leaving his wife a direction while the life drained out of him. Less than 2 hours after he was shot, he died at the place where he had fallen. When the immediate shock eased enough for men to think like investigators, they began asking how the ambush had been arranged. The lane to the ranch and the oak tree were examined as part of the plan. Investigators sought to learn who knew Bobbitt's schedule that day, who saw him load the meal in Ada, and how the shooter timed his movement to reach the lane near sundown. In the days that followed, officers and citizens reconstructed Bobbitt's movements, and they collected the small observations that seemed harmless before the murder and crucial after it. Bobbitt's standing made that reconstruction relentless. In earlier years, he had worked closely with United States District Attorney Andrew Cavett, A.C. Cruz, and people around Ada remembered him as a man who pushed against crime even after he no longer wore a badge. That reputation meant his death did not fall into the category of a private quarrel. It was taken as an attack on the town's ability to protect itself. Friends of Bobbitt and citizens who trusted him pressed the authorities to keep moving, to keep names attached to evidence, and to keep the case from fading into rumor. Law officers arrived to a scene already disturbed by wagons, footprints, and grief, yet the lane still held evidence. Near the oak and along the route the killer used, investigators found fence wire that had been cut, and near the scene they found wire cutters. The tool was not a random loss, it was equipment used to clip fence lines and cross property without opening gates. The fence cuts showed a practical path in and out, a route designed to avoid houses, dogs, and curious eyes. The physical evidence did not end with the cutters. Miller had to reach the oak without riding directly through front gates and yards. The fence cuts around the area showed that someone had clipped wire in multiple places to cross fields quickly. The cutters found near the scene fit those cuts. Once the tool was traced to Barry Burrell, officers treated him as more than a bystander. Burrell had been a bank cashier and later a livestock trader, and he had also been associated with Miller in criminal schemes that involved murder and land fraud. The murder scene now carried an object that pointed directly toward Burrell's hands. Ferguson's description of the brown mare became another lead. Men who lived by stock knew each other's animals, and the distinctive markings narrowed the search. The mare was traced to Francis, northeast of Ada, at the place of John Williamson, Miller's nephew. Williamson gave a statement that he had loaned the mare to Miller and that Miller admitted killing Bobbitt. The loaned horse matched the rider Ferguson and Bobbitt had seen earlier on the road, a well-dressed man on an unexpected farm mount. The wire cutters were traced to Burrell by the purchase trail. Burrell had moved in respectable business roles and in livestock trading, and records and testimony connected him to the cutters later found at the murder site. The tool link mattered because it showed preparation and support, not only a lone shooter choosing a tree, but an arrangement that equipped the shooter and helped him move unseen. Investigators also treated Burrell as a watcher and messenger, a man who observed Bobbitt's routines and then informed Miller when the timing was right to strike. Ferguson's role as the trailing neighbor gave the case another advantage, a living witness with clear sensory memory. He and Bobbitt had both seen the well-dressed rider earlier in the day. Ferguson's description of the tie, the riding cap, and the brown mare with distinctive markings anchored the search. After the shooting, Ferguson had also seen the shooter close enough to describe his appearance. Those descriptions mattered because the defense could attack motives and hearsay, but a witness describing clothing, posture, and an identifiable horse created facts that could be compared against other statements. Bobbitt himself had prepared for the possibility of being killed. Years earlier, after West and Allen had been forced out of the region, Bobbitt drew up a will and set aside a reward of $1,000 for the capture of the guilty party if he was murdered. The document was not bravado. It was a practical response from a man who understood that long resentments did not die just because men moved away. After Bobbitt lay dead in his lane, that reward became part of the public talk, proof that he had expected retaliation and had tried to leave a lever his family could pull if the worst happened. Investigators followed the support trail further. A killer operating near Ada needed a place to stay and a way to remain close to the target without drawing attention. The rented house where Miller stayed brought a teenager, Oscar Peeler, into the case. Peeler had rented the place used by Miller, and his role offered a clean line into the conspirators' logistics. Peeler gave statements that West had sent checks to cover the rent. The checks showed a chain of responsibility, money moving from a man with motive toward the house that kept the killer close to Ada without drawing attention. As each piece became public, West and Allen's earlier history returned in sharper detail. They had lived and worked in the region until the fallouts that culminated in their departure in 1903. After leaving, they settled near Canadian in the Texas Panhandle, keeping their own networks and their own resentments. When they began discussing a return, people around Ada heard it as more than a business move. They heard it as a threat because the conflict with Bobbitt had never ended in reconciliation, it had ended in force. The community already had a framework for motive. West and Allen had a history with Bobbitt that went back years, through the violent liquor and saloon world at a place called Corner, through disputes that had forced them out of the region by 1903, and through the bitterness of exile. In the year before the murder, West had written to Tom Hope, the president of the Ada National Bank, discussing a return. Hope replied on the 8th day of August 1908, encouraging West to return and praising opportunity in the area. The letter existed as a document, a piece of paper that linked old relationships to new violence, and it became part of the atmosphere surrounding the case. Arrests began outside Oklahoma. Burrell was arrested in Fort Worth, Texas on the 23rd day of March 1909. Miller was arrested near Fort Worth on the 31st day of March. Taking Miller alive created a different kind of tension because an alive Miller meant court fights, motions, and the chance that a skilled defense could grind the case down into doubt. On the 6th day of April 1909, officers arrested Jesse West and Joe Allen at the train depot in Oklahoma City. After the arrest, West told Detective Robert Moore, "I would have killed him on sight. I didn't kill him, but that was the only reason I didn't get the chance. But they will kill us if you take us back to Ada." The words were a confession of intent and a measure of fear, and both carried weight with officers who knew how quickly a town's anger could turn. West and Allen sought legal protection. They met with Mormon Moman Pruitt, a defense attorney known for hard-edged courtroom strategy. Pruitt agreed to represent them and also Miller. The choice signaled that the accused men were not depending on innocence to save them. They were depending on procedure, delay, and the ability to fracture testimony. By that point, Miller, Burrell, West, and Allen were placed in the Ada jail. Guards tightened their routines, checking locks repeatedly and watching the building at night because the jail held men accused of a killing that the town regarded as a paid assassination. A preliminary hearing brought the story into public view: the feed wagons, the well-dressed rider, the oak tree, the two blasts, the pellets in Bobbitt's body, Tennessee holding him as he spoke, and the evidence trail that followed: wire cutters traced to Burrell, a mare traced to Williamson, checks connected to West, and a shooter identified as Miller. As the hearing unfolded, Ada's attention narrowed onto a single question: whether the courts would finish the case before the defense pulled it apart. Men in town began speaking less in general outrage and more in practical terms: timing, numbers, tools, and whether the guards could be subdued without gunfire. The jail stood in the center of that tightening pressure, and every night that passed with the accused alive behind bars added weight to the belief that the decision would not be left to a jury. Sunday, the 18th day of April, 1909, Ada settled into evening with the kind of watchful calm that follows a killing and a hearing, when every citizen knew exactly which building held the men blamed for it. The jail sat close to the center of town life, close enough that footsteps and voices carried to nearby porches at night. Inside, 4 prisoners waited behind barred doors: Jim Miller, Barry Burrell, Jesse West, and Joe Allen. Guards rotated through short shifts, and the keys and firearms were handled with deliberate care, because the county already knew that a courthouse process could move slower than public anger. The preliminary hearing had just laid out the evidence chain, and even citizens who believed the men were guilty could see the weak spot the defense would try to pry open: jurors who refused to convict, witnesses who backed away, and the long history of killers leaving courtrooms unpunished. That Sunday night, men began gathering in small knots on the streets. Some arrived alone and stayed in the shadows near storefronts. Others came in pairs, speaking in low voices, scanning for familiar faces, checking whether the law was watching. No one carried a banner. No one issued a proclamation in the open. The plan moved through whispers and nods, and through the shared memory of other cases where juries had returned not guilty verdicts and murderers had walked away smiling. The courthouse square grew unnaturally quiet, then unnaturally busy. Men drifted into place without looking like a crowd. Lantern light moved between bodies. Cigarette tips glowed and vanished. A few men carried coils of new rope under their coats. Others brought baling wire, short and stiff, the kind used on farms, the kind that could bind wrists fast and cut skin when it was tightened. County Attorney Robert Wimbish confronted the group as it moved toward the jail. He spoke the same words every official spoke in that situation: that the law would take its course, that Oklahoma was a state now, that Ada did not need vigilantes. His voice did not stop the movement. The men kept walking because they believed the law's course was exactly what had failed again and again. Wimbish stepped aside and the line continued. Night deepened. In the early hours of Monday, the 19th day of April, the mob's leaders acted on the part of the plan that required the most control: darkness. Some of them went to the power plant and forced an engineer to switch off the streetlights. The lamps that usually threw pale pools of light across Ada's streets went dark. The town did not become silent, but it became harder to see. And that blindness mattered. A mob that cannot be identified cannot be prosecuted, and the men moving toward the jail wanted the town itself to hide them. Within that darkness, the group reached the jailhouse door. 4 men were inside to resist them: Deputy Sheriff and Jailer Walter Goyne, part-time Deputy Bob Nestor, Night Guard Joe Carter, and James McCarty. The mob forced its way in and quickly took the advantage. A weapon drawn at the right moment does not need to be fired to win. The guards were outnumbered, surprised, and trapped in a small building with a single purpose. Orders came in short, hard phrases. Keys were demanded. A door was opened under threat. Nestor reached for his pistol. The attempt earned him a clubbing that dropped him, then hands tied so tight his fingers swelled. Goyne was forced into submission and bound with baling wire, the stiff strands biting his wrists. Carter made it outside, but the crowd did not allow him back in. McCarty did not deliver a statement afterward, and the silence of a man in that moment spoke its own language: that the town's tide had turned too far for any single person to halt it. 2 officials appeared in the same dead hours: County Judge Joel Terrell and Night Policeman Lee West. Their presence did not slow the rope men. It revealed a deeper truth: that some people in authority knew what was coming and chose to stand near it rather than stop it. Their pleas did not carry force. The crowd did not answer with debate. It answered with action. The cell corridor smelled of damp stone and old sweat. The sound of boots and metal keys echoed in the narrow space. The mob moved from door to door and dragged the 4 accused men into the open. The prisoners were ordered to dress and move quickly. Baling wire and rope were used to bind wrists behind backs, not for neatness, but to remove any chance of resistance. Skin split where the wire bit, and blood spotted sleeves and cuffs. Joe Allen went pale under the lantern light, breathing through clenched teeth. Barry Burrell looked stunned, his face frozen as if he could not accept that procedure had ended and raw force had replaced it. Jesse West resisted. He spoke threats and fought against the hands on him. He was beaten for it, and the beating was not a fistfight. It was punishment delivered by men who believed they were doing work for the whole town. The blows landed with the dull sound of leather and bone, and West's defiance broke into grunts and spit. Jim Miller stayed different. He had lived a long time by refusing to give other men the satisfaction of seeing him beg. He knew the shape of a rope and the purpose of a mob. In earlier towns, he had used calm to discourage witnesses. Now calm was all he had left. He asked for speed, not mercy. If they intended to hang him, he told them to do it quick. He removed a diamond ring and asked that it be given to his wife, Sally, as the only request that still had meaning. He asked to keep his black hat, the same hat that helped him look like a respectable man when he walked into a room. The hat was allowed. His request to die in his black coat was refused. The 4 were marched out of the jail. The distance to the livery stable was short, close enough that the killers did not need wagons. In the dark, that short walk felt longer. The prisoners' boots scraped over dirt and boardwalk. The wire on their wrists dragged their shoulders back and made every step awkward. Men with ropes walked behind and beside them, close enough to strike if anyone stumbled or turned. The stable stood as an ordinary business building in daylight, a place of hay, manure, sweat, and the constant shift of animals and stalls. At night it became a chamber. The loft rafters and heavy beams offered strong anchor points. Lanterns were brought inside and placed where hands could work. The light flickered across plank walls and across the faces of men who avoided looking directly at what they were doing because looking too long makes a man feel the weight of it. Ropes were lifted up and thrown over rafters. The nooses were not hangman's knots meant to break a neck clean. They were simple loops. A simple loop tightens under weight and does not release. It makes death slow. It does not end a man with a snap. It ends him with strangulation minute by minute as the body fights to breathe and fails. The mob chose an order. One by one, the prisoners were pulled onto boxes or makeshift supports. A loop was placed around a throat. Hands held the rope steady while other hands shoved the body into position. The supports were kicked away and the weight settled. The men began to choke, their legs jerking, their boots scraping as they tried to find purchase on air. Joe Allen's face darkened as the loop cut off blood and breath. His hands, bound behind him, could not reach the rope. His feet kicked, then slowed as strength drained. Barry Burrell's body shook as the loop tightened. His eyes bulged under the lantern light and his mouth opened in a silent effort that produced no air. Jesse West swung and thrashed longer than the others because he had fought hard and still had fury in his muscles. That fury could not undo the rope. It only made the struggle uglier. Jim Miller went last. In the seconds before his support was removed, he looked out into the dim stable and saw men who had decided his church-going meant nothing. He was not given the dignity of a courtroom verdict. He was given the rope. He wore his black hat as requested, the brim shadowing his face. The loop was set, the support was kicked, and his body dropped into the same slow choking that had taken the others. The hat stayed on as his legs kicked, then slowed, then hung still. Outside, Ada stayed dark. Streetlights remained off. Most citizens slept. Others stayed awake and listened for sound. In that kind of town, some people sensed when something irreversible had happened even if they did not see it. The night carried a smell that mixed smoke from lanterns with the stale odor of a stable, and behind that odor lay the reality of 4 bodies turning into weight on ropes. Just after sunrise, the town moved toward the stable. Men came first, then women and older children drawn by word spreading through kitchens and sidewalks. The stable doors opened to daylight, and the scene inside stopped conversation. 4 bodies hung from the rafters, lined up in a way that made the message unmistakable. Clothing hung loose, boots pointed down. Faces were swollen and dark. The ropes had done what the jury had not been allowed to do. Some locals stared with relief. Others stared with a sickness that did not find words. No one could claim it was a private act. It had been done for public viewing, and it had been arranged so that Ada would never forget it. Photographers captured the result. Prints traveled beyond the town. The image became a national embarrassment and also, for many in the region, a crude warning to anyone who believed hired killing could be treated like ordinary work. The official response began late, because the leaders with the authority to stop it were absent or silent. Sheriff Tom Smith was out of town that night. That absence raised suspicion in itself. Governor Charles N. Haskell demanded explanations once he was notified, and he ordered a special grand jury to investigate. The grand jury met for 3 days and interviewed 28 people who had knowledge of the event or had been present in the hours around it. No member of the mob was identified. Not one witness offered a name the state could prosecute. The men who had pulled the prisoners from the jail had covered their faces or moved in darkness, and the town's code of silence completed the protection. The grand jury produced a statement of regret and also a statement of blame, pointing to delayed justice as the condition that created vigilantism. The report did not reverse the hangings. It did not punish the hangers. It only placed official words on what everyone already knew. For Ada, the hangings were not only a violent ending, they were a public declaration that patience had run out. The men in the town had watched Miller's kind survive trials for decades, watched witnesses bend, watched jurors refuse to convict, and watched killers return to work. The method of murder that Miller represented, the ambush at a gate, the shotgun at a card table, the patient wait behind an oak, had created fear that could not be soothed by sermons or by legal language. Miller had claimed a religious posture and carried a Sunday face, yet his reputation, his weapons, and his associates had convinced people that he killed for money and used faith as cover. In that belief, the town saw him as a threat that would keep feeding on the region as long as he breathed. The rope men did not argue that he deserved prison. They argued that he deserved removal. They made it permanent with beams, loops, and lantern light. The hangings also changed the behavior of the men who hired killers. A contract killing depends on distance and deniability. It depends on the belief that even if the killer is arrested, he can beat the case. Ada offered a different outcome, that a killer's history could become so heavy that a community would bypass the courts entirely. Men who considered hiring assassins heard the story and learned a lesson written in rope, that the danger did not always end with a jury. Sometimes it ended with a stable rafter. For lawmen, the event carried its own bitter message. It proved that a jail could be breached and a prisoner could be taken even under guard if a determined crowd chose to do it. It also proved that citizens could decide they no longer recognized the authority of the badge when they believed the courts were broken. That realization did not strengthen law enforcement. It exposed its limits. A sheriff could arrest. A prosecutor could charge. A judge could schedule a trial. None of it mattered if a town decided to deliver its own verdict first. The bodies were cut down and handled like the remains of men who no longer had any power. The ropes were unfastened. The loops that had tightened through the night went slack. The beams remained stained by smoke and time, and the stable returned to its ordinary purpose, feeding horses and holding hay, while the memory of that morning remained lodged in every person who had stood under those rafters and looked up. Jim Miller's life ended without a legal verdict. His death did not come by pistol shot in the street or by a duel at noon. It came by the collective decision of a town that believed it had already seen the future if he was allowed to live. More ambushes, more widows, more juries that failed, and more killers hiding behind good manners and church talk. Ada chose to stop the pattern in the only way it believed would last, and it left the record hanging in plain sight.